Hello everyone, and welcome back to a brand new video. This is my first video I've made in a while, so I wanted to make something easy to get back into things. And what's easier than making a ranking video, right? Of course, as is the trend on this channel, whenever I am struggling with a topic, I turn to talking about music. Even though I honestly hate when people talk about music online, I figured that's more of an issue of the type of person who feels the need to talk about music online versus the act of doing it in general. Also, this video is about fucking Sematary, so I'm not here to take things too seriously, alright? Also, I'm not like a crazy music nerd or anything. I'm just a guy with ears who wants to talk about a group of artists that I think are really interesting. Speaking of which, I assume if you clicked on this video, you probably have some sort of idea who Sematary and the rest of the Haunted Mound are, but if for some reason you don't, I'll give you a very brief explanation. Sematary is an American rapper from the middle of nowhere in Northern California. His music has a very unique sound. It's a weird, fucked up mess of witchhouse, trap, and drill music. I believe his sound still hasn't been perfectly replicated by anyone else yet. However, this is most likely due to the fact that, as you'll soon see in this ranking, a lot of the time it doesn't sound too great, and it's definitely a very specific taste. In 2019, Sematary would found the collective Haunted Mound with his then collaborator and close friend Ghost Mountain. A year or so later, the artist Buckshot would join Haunted Mound, and in 2021, around the release of Rainbow Bridge 3, Sematary and Ghost Mountain would have a falling out, prompting Ghost Mountain to leave the group and quit music entirely. Shortly after this, the artist Hackle and Turnabout would join the collective, as well as the producer Gonerville. Unfortunately, in March of this year, Turnabout and Gonerville left the Haunted Mound because, surprise surprise, Sematary is kind of a dick. And yes, I know I forgot a lot of stuff, but this video isn't about what Haunted Mound is, it's about the music. Last thing I will say before the ranking is I'm a pretty big fan of the Haunted Mound. I've seen them live a couple times, have quite a few shirts, and a Herald chain. However, that doesn't mean I think everything they produce is good. And as you'll see in this video, I honestly feel like there's more misses than hits. But damn, when it hits, it hits. Also, I will be including Cutter Lane, Lord of Ephraim, and Obscura Noctis Moors on this list, since Turnabout made those projects while still being in Haunted Mound. This also means I won't talk about Mortem Solus, but I didn't like that album anyway, so yeah. Anyway, that's enough yapping, it's time to start the ranking. Alright, coming in at dead last by a landslide is, to what I hope is nobody's surprise, King of the Graveyard by Sematary. One thing I noticed about my ranking is that my top and bottom picks are pretty similar to the community consensus on these albums. At least I think so. But yeah, King of the Graveyard is Sematary's second EP, and in its brief 5-track runtime, it manages to blow ass the whole way through. Before I discuss all the issues I have with this EP, I will say the only good thing about this EP is Turnabout's feature on 3am Gang. It almost makes that song listenable. But okay, why is this project at the bottom of the list? Well, a common trend in Sematary's music is very repetitive lyrics. However, most of the time, this isn't really an issue. Even on his weaker projects, most of the time the repetitive lyricism isn't what makes them bad. But on King of the Graveyard, it is exceptionally bad. The chorus of each of these tracks is miserable to listen to. I was going to try to isolate one song as an example, but they are all so equally terrible. In addition, what is normally the strongest part of Sematary's work, his production, is pretty lackluster on this. From the beats themselves to how his voice sounds, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but it just does not sound good to me. It sounds like he was trying to make a mix of Butcher House and Rainbow Bridge 3. Clearly, those sounds don't mesh well together. That's enough on King of the Graveyard. There are actual good albums I want to talk about, but unfortunately we still have a bit of shit to trudge through. Alright, luckily from this point on I should have something good to say about each project on this list. And almost every project has at least 1 or 2 songs I find myself coming back to. However, that still doesn't mean these next couple of projects are good. And number 15 on this list is no exception. Haunted Nation by Hackle. Haunted Nation is Hackle's second mixtape, and in all honesty, it hurts seeing it this low. I mean, the cover art was crazy, the single Lash Out was pretty good, and it was the return of DJ Sorrow. However, once the tape actually released, I was pretty disappointed. I will say though, with time, it has grown on me slightly. However, However, it's mainly just the few songs I like that I seem to just be liking more and more. Those songs being Lash Out, Dust 2, and Left My Heart in Houston. Overall, however, most of the songs on this project are pretty forgettable. I think that is mainly due to a lot of the songs sounding very samey. The beats and lyrics on these songs are all very similar to one another, making the whole thing less memorable. Also, the inclusion of DJ Sorrow on this feels very unnecessary and tacked on. Of course, as I already mentioned, there are songs on here I really like, and I think the best song by far is Left My Heart in Houston. I also think Dust 2 is really funny because, I mean, it's a song about CSGO with lyrics like Shout Out Valve. At the end of the day, Haunted Nation has its moments, however, those moments are drowning in a sea of mediocrity.
Good, you drinking water, bro. I see your Insta, all you eat.
At number 14 is Sematary's 5th solo project, Screaming Forest. Screaming Forest is an interesting album as it was his first project after Rainbow Bridge 3 and Ghost Mountain's departure. I think because of this, a lot of people tend to compare Screaming Forest to Rainbow Bridge 3, though honestly, I feel like this album is closer to Rainbow Bridge 1. The obvious comparison being the sample used on the song Redwoods is the same Smashing Pumpkins sample from Bunny Suit. But also, this album feels like Sematary pressing a soft reset button, as it feels like a stripped back version of not just Rainbow Bridge 3, but his entire discography until this point. Even in a vacuum, this album feels stripped back, and it suffers from the same issues that a lot of these lower ranked projects have, the main one being a lack of rememberability. Screaming Forest definitely suffers from this with bland hooks and forgettable production. That's not to say it's all bad. The songs I Hail the Night and Comma Crazy are definitely the standouts for me, and even Redwoods has grown on me. Also, I know this has nothing to do with the quality of the music, but the music videos and imagery of this entire Haunted Mound era are really good. The album really does feel like a blueprint or prototype of what Sematary and the Haunted Mound as a whole would continue to make. However, just like Haunted Nation, the good stuff is buried in a pile of shit. At least the shit on this album is a little better than Haunted Nation, giving it the edge overall. Man, it honestly sucks that both of Hackle's solo projects ended up in the bottom 5, but Gunsmith the mixtape just never really clicked for me. On my first listen, I actually enjoyed it quite a bit, however with time, I find myself coming back to it less and less. I think my opinion on this one is a little more subjective, as the tape is way more memorable than the ones that came before it. It also has a really good Buckshot feature, something that the other projects before this did not have. However, my problem stems from how it fits in with everything else the Haunted Mound has made. Part of why I enjoy Haunted Mound music is how different it sounds and how it hasn't really been replicated by anyone to the same quality. However, I feel like Gunsmith is one of the more generic sounding Haunted Mound projects, which I think makes it a little boring. But at the same time, it is a very consistent body of work that can still be enjoyable to listen to. It's just when you compare it to the other projects on this list, they take a lot more risks, and as a result, they are way more interesting. Of course, sometimes a risk is taken and you end up with King of the Graveyard, but that's besides the point. I think Bakelight, Nothing, and Dumbo are the best tracks on this album. Dumbo in particular is very good due to the Buckshot feature. However, overall, I think this album still feels pretty stale, but it's a good kind of stale. In all honesty, Cutter Lane by Turnabout would be much lower on this list if it wasn't for one single song. It's hard for me to pinpoint what I don't like about this album. I think the main issue is that a lot of the songs will start in the middle of the chorus and then basically restart the song in the middle of it, and I've just never been a fan of that way of structuring a song. I do see the appeal to this album. I think it just suffers from the same thing as Gunsmith, where there are not only better Haunted Mound projects, but also better Turnabout projects, and I think because of this, I don't find myself returning to this tape often. However, this mixtape contains not just one of my favorite Haunted Mound songs, but one of my favorite songs of all time, Old Highway 28. I don't have too much left to add about this album. I think with Cutter Lane, you will either really like it or feel impartial to it like I do. Coming in at number 11 is Sematary's first ever mixtape, Gravehouse. This was also the first of 2 collaborative tapes with Ghost Mountain, and for their first project ever, I would say it's a solid body of work. However, it also comes with all of the issues being the first comes with. I think the biggest complaints I have, and that it seems most other people have, is that the songs on this tape are just too long. It feels like Sematary and Ghost Mountain didn't really know the best way to divide up a collaborative project like this, leading to many of the songs overstaying their welcome. Of course, there are some exceptions, like the final song on the album, Broken Angel Hospital, is 6.5 minutes long, but it's one of my favorites on the album. The album also has the song Nevada, which many people, including myself, believe to be one of the best Haunted Mound songs ever, and is a personal favorite of mine. Unfortunately though, I find the vocal mixing on this project to be pretty inconsistent, and you can really tell Sematary is trying to find his footing when it comes to vocals. Ghost vocals are pretty standard throughout the whole thing, but after hearing what has come after this, you can definitely hear the lesser quality on this project. Overall, this album can feel like it has a lot of filler at times. However, the filler also features Ghost Mountain, which makes it a little more pleasant to listen to. The tape also shows how good of a duo Ghost and Sematary were, and makes their falling out even more tragic. I honestly had a really hard time deciding where Lord of Ephraim should go on this list. We are reaching to the point in my ranking where my issues with each project are becoming more and more minute and subjective. If this was a tier list, I think Lord of Ephraim would sit very comfortably at the top of C tier. I think this album is a very good showcase of what Haunted Mound is, and is an album I think people who are first starting to listen to Haunted Mound should listen to. The album obviously has some misses and forgettable moments. However, this is probably the first album on this list where the positives outweigh the negatives. However, the main reason this album is still in the bottom half of my ranking is just how it stacks up against the other albums on this list. There are albums that do way more interesting things that sound just as good as Lord of Ephraim. Not to say this album doesn't have any highlights, like the songs Feel Like God, Chalice with Black Cray, and of course Early Morning Ritual. Unfortunately, I always find myself coming back to this album less and less, but I'd recommend you listen to it if you haven't before, or if you have, give it another listen. Hackle's feature on Nightmare Whip is so fucking goofy, but in like a hard ass way. Alright, now we are about to get into the good stuff. And rounding off the bottom half of this list is Sematary's first EP, Warboy. Unfortunately, similar to Gravehouse, Warboy has been removed from streaming services. Sematary has also been teasing a remake of Warboy for the past year, even playing one of the best songs of the album, A 10,000 Weeping Choirs, at shows. However, since as of the time of making this video, the remake isn't out yet, I'll be talking about the 2020 release. The EP is only 4 tracks long, but 3 of those tracks are straight up bangers. The weakest track to me is Red Bull Addict, and you definitely have to be in the mood for the track AK-47. But what really does it for me on this album is the song Skulls. This song is a cover of the Misfits song of the same name. Well, I mean, the verses are different, but Sematary uses the same chorus. AK-47 also samples Mother by Danzig, which I think is really cool. I wish Sematary would sample more. I think that is part of what made his old music so special. This EP unfortunately loses points because of its length, and with a track list so short, you really don't have room to fuck up. Also, the tracks on this feel like they could be on a deluxe version of Rainbow Bridge 2, which I think takes away from the quality just a little bit. I also think Rainbow Bridge 2's sound is the weakest in the trilogy, but I'll talk more about that once we get to Rainbow Bridge 2 very soon. It's also hard for me to rate Warboy higher when there is another 4-track long EP in this ranking that has absolutely 0 misses on it. Overall though, Warboy is still definitely worth a listen, and I'm super excited to hear the remade version of it. Starting off the second half of this list is, in my opinion, the weakest Rainbow Bridge album, Rainbow Bridge 2. Out of all of the Rainbow Bridge projects, I find myself returning to this one the least. That's not to say there aren't good tracks on here. I really enjoyed Desecration and Funeral, as well as the song Red Mist. I also really like how dense this album sounds. The vocals are all like drowned out, and the production is super bassy and super intense, but in like a chill way. Like it almost feels like a way more chilled out version of Rainbow Bridge 3. Unfortunately, for as unique as this sound is compared to the rest of Sematary's work, there are still quite a few projects that I like more. And it's not because Rainbow Bridge 2 is bad. In fact, I would agree that it is underrated. However, the top half of this list is some of the most brutal brutal competition, and one project had to fill this spot. Also, throughout 2020, Sematary released a few projects with this type of sound, and let's just say one of those projects blows this one out of the water. There are some songs that I'm not a fan of, but overall this project is a solid body of work. Its few shortcomings are magnified by the fact that it is being compared to other solid bodies of work that I just find myself enjoying much more. The album does have its moments, and it is a good Sematary record, but at this point in the ranking, that is not good enough to be any higher than 8th. Sematary's mixtape Butcher House is one that I enjoy more and more as time goes on. Similar to Lord of Ephraim, this album is a solid introduction to the sound of Haunted Mound. And while it doesn't sound as intense as Rainbow Bridge 3, which this album gets compared to a lot, it still has the very intense energy and vibes as that project. Butcher House really feels like Sematary figured out how to display his imagery and sound in a way that is not only digestible for newcomers, but also keeps core fans entertained. There is a lot of songs on this album that are very solid. However, there aren't a lot of songs that are really good or super special. Some of my favorite tracks off this album are Suffer, Hate and Gasoline, and Baba Yaga. That's not to say those are the only good songs from the album, those are just the ones that stick out to me personally. This is probably the first album on this list where I can comfortably say that there are no bad songs on here. However, ultimately, Butcher House loses points for its sound feeling just a little too safe, earning it its 7th place spot. At number 6 is, at the time of recording this, Sematary's most recent album, Bloody Angel. I fucking love this album. Now, before I start glazing this album, I will say, compared to a project like Butcher House, this album has way more misses. But when this album hits, oh my lord, it hits. Sematary experiments with a new sound on this project, which can be heard on the tracks Wendigo, Headlights, Benadryl Angel, and my favorite song from the album, Dead Trees. Unsurprisingly, the songs that feature this new synthy style are also what I think are the best songs on the album. That's not to say that they are the only good songs on the album. I enjoy Mordor and Borrow Whites. It's just the new style is the standout of this album, and I'm praying Sematary continues in this direction. Honestly, I found it hard to decide which album I liked more between Bloody Angel and Butcher House. Overall, because of the uniqueness of the sound on this project, I give Bloody Angel the edge. However, compared to Butcher House, this album has some stinkers. There are some songs like Hockey Mask 2 and Parking Lot Scarecrow that are not for me, but I do see the appeal. But oh my god, Sacrifice and Demon in Pain are just so incredibly bad. To end on a more positive note, Buried My Heart is such a fucking good interlude and really shows how surprisingly well paced this album feels. This album also has one or potentially two Twin Peaks references, which will be a very important metric going forward.
What's your favorite candy bar?
I don't give a fuck about candy bars.
Entering the top 5, now is the point in the list where I think these albums kind of transcend the niche that is Haunted Mound music. These albums are the cream of the crop when it comes to Haunted Mound projects. And starting off the top 5, we have Sematary's Rainbow Bridge. Released in 2019, Sematary's second mixtape is a classic and a great start to the trilogy of Rainbow Bridge albums. I'll be honest, most of the songs I like on this album are the ones featuring Ghost Mountain, but the songs Reverence, Cemetery, and To Nobody's Surprise Slaughterhouse are extremely good solo songs. The album feels like a direct upgrade to Gravehouse, and it is insane to see the progress Sematary made between the two projects. This project is filled with metal samples, and Sematary just had a way with sampling back then that is just so good and really helps give Rainbow Bridge a more metal feel. I also think Sematary is at his best when he samples in this way. I really wish I had more to say about this album, but I just really love it, and it's hard for me to find more ways I can get that point across. One thing I will talk about is the song Pain featuring Ghost Mountain. Pain was removed from almost every release of Rainbow Bridge 3, which is a shame because if it was still on the album, it would definitely be the best off the album, and I highly recommend listening to it if you have not already. If you've made it this far in the video and have been paying very close attention, you will notice that there is a certain EP I still have not talked about. I'm also sure those familiar with the Haunted Mound might be confused as to why it hasn't shown up yet. Well, do not worry, because at number 4 is Obscura Noctis Mors by Turnabout. Now let me tell you, this EP is special. I remember when I first heard Luctus Main and realized that whatever project followed this was going to be insane. The moment on the song when Goner's producer tag gets cut off had me feeling some type of way. It is then announced that Turn is releasing an EP and that it is part 1 of a bigger project. Unfortunately, Obscura Noctis Mors is only 4 tracks long. However, these 4 tracks completely solo anything on the bottom half of this list. The new sound Turnabout was making on this sounded amazing. It felt so different from anything from the Haunted Mound, yet its influence can still be felt throughout the entire thing. This EP is Turnabout at his absolute best. I bought the goddamn Grimy Kids collab because of how good this EP is. As much as I glaze this project, I ultimately cannot put it any higher due to the fact that it is only 4 tracks and the last track is just a beat Goner made. Granted, it still goes hard, but at the end of the day, the EP only has 4 tracks. Did one of them really need to be just a beat? Of course, shortly after the release of Obscura Noctis Mors, Turnabout and Gonerville would leave the Haunted Mound, which was very disheartening to see. I guess I will briefly talk about Mortem Solus since it is the follow-up to this EP. All I really have to say about it is that shit is so ass, bro. Alright, I feel like my top 3 picks here are definitely pretty standard across the board when it comes to Haunted Mound rankings. Like I said at the start of the video, I feel like my opinions on what are the worst and best projects align with community consensus very well. With that being said, coming in at number 3 is Burning Barn, Buckshot's first and so far only mixtape. Burning Barn is an amazing album. I would say out of all the Haunted Mound projects, this one has the best lyrics. The lyrics in these songs really immerse you in the world of Buckshot's head. The lyrics on Keep Out, Long Walk Home, and In the Morning have really strong imagery and paint an immersive picture for the listener. However, for me, my absolute favorite song on this album is Over the Hills. You can really hear the emotion in Buckshot's vocals on it, something that is missing on a lot of the other Haunted Mound projects. This project overall, I would say, is the most emotional in the entire Haunted Mound discography. Some moments on Semetary's Bloody Angel come close, but as a whole, Burning Barn solos when it comes to emotionalness. Another point in Burning Barn's favor is that the themes on this album are consistent throughout each track, and everything feels extremely intentional and well put together. The theme of this album is super dark. A lot of people call this album the darkest Haunted Mound album, and for good reason. The themes throughout the album can be overly simplified to deteriorating mental health and substance abuse. Listening to this whole thing front to back in one sitting can actually be kind of a heavy experience, which is something I can't even say about the final 2 projects ranked above this. I definitely recommend this album to people who don't like Sematary but still like music adjacent to it. With just one album, Buckshot has solidified himself as my favorite artist currently in the Haunted Mound.
DJ Sorrow, turn the fuck up.
Rainbow Bridge 3 is Sematary's best solo project. Rainbow Bridge 3, being as good as it is, has been both a blessing and a curse for Sematary. The blessing being that it is his best solo work, which I'll talk about why I think that very shortly. The curse being that this album was released very early on in his career, and now everything that he puts out after is constantly compared to it. This album is absolute absurdity and insanity in the best way possible. Rainbow Bridge 3 is Sematary at his peak. I find it really hard to explain why this album is so good, because like the first couple of times I listened to it, I hated this album, and honestly I think that is a normal first listen experience. But then you hear one song that kind of clicks for you. For me, that song was Creeping Through the Woods, and after forming an attachment to that song, I found myself enjoying more and more songs on Rainbow Bridge 3. Another thing that draws me to this album is the fact that nobody, not even Sematary himself, has made an album that sounds this way and has the same vibe. Rainbow Bridge 3 exists in this weird gray area of irony. Like, the sound is super abrasive and the lyricism is fucking absurd, but it's all done so well that it doesn't feel like a shitpost. The quality of this album comes from the fact that every decision Sematary made while creating it was intentional. On the first listen, you may not notice that, but give this album some time and you'll understand the pure genius that Sematary once was. This album is the best display of Sematary's music and his image, and I genuinely think with the direction he is going, he will never be able to top this album. I think my favorite song off the album is either Chainsaw Party or Goin' Mortem with Ghost Mountain. Obviously there are a ton of other good songs on here, those are just 2 that really stand out to me. The album also has the second best usage of DJ Sorrow. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but the goofy ass tags just help enhance the absurd vibe even more. Also, this album has a total of 1 Twin Peaks reference on it. As I already mentioned, Rainbow Bridge 3 is peak Sematary. However, there is one project that narrowly passes it.
I regret everything I've done.
Coming in at number 1 to what I hope is nobody's surprise is 100 Acre Wrist, the second and final collaborative tape between Sematary and Ghost Mountain. When it comes to my relationship with horror media, I really like spooky shit in the woods. Not really sure if that genre has a name, but whatever that genre is, 100 Acre Wrist captures it perfectly. This is gonna sound strange, but this album really makes you feel like you're deep in the woods. The album is also the closest we will get to a solo Ghost Mountain project, and because of this, the whole album has a much more melodic and palatable vibe. That is probably the main draw for me, as well as the atmosphere on this album being the best out of any Haunted Mound project. As opposed to the projects that came before it, 100 Acre Wrist uses original guitar samples rather than sampling death metal songs. I'm pretty sure most of, if not all, the guitars are performed by Ghost Mountain, and I think that really elevates the production as it makes everything feel much more concise overall. It is no secret Ghost Mountain steals the show on this. However, a lot of people will say that Sematary's performance on this isn't good, which I think is crazy. On the songs Sigil and Taxidermy, I actually prefer Sematary's verses to Ghost Mountain's. But yeah, Ghost Mountain's vocals and lyricism are super unique compared to the rest of the Haunted Mound, which I think makes this tape really special. Also, as opposed to Gravehouse, it feels like the duo figured out how to divide the songs amongst themselves, making the pacing of this project better overall compared to Gravehouse. When it comes to standouts, I genuinely love every track on this album. Like, this project does not have a dull moment on it at all. My favorite songs though are probably Heffalumps, Nazgul, and Dear God. But I genuinely mean it when I say I don't think this album has a single bad song. The final song of the album, Cleaver Valley, is such a great way to end the album. It really captures the rural feeling of living in the woods. Unfortunately, this album is no longer on streaming services. You can still find it on YouTube and SoundCloud, and if you're a sucker like me, you can purchase the album on Bandcamp. I love this album to death, and it really is a shame Sematary and Ghost Mountain fell out the way they did. Also, pretty sure this album has a solid 2 Twin Peaks references on it. Maybe someday I will make a video about the show. Let me know if I should in the comments. Anyway, to wrap up my thoughts on 100 Acre Wrist, all I really have left to say is please listen to it. It's 10 songs and you won't find anything else like it. But that is the end of my definitive Haunted Mound ranking. Thank you so much for watching, and if you made it this far, you're a real one. Of course, if you haven't already, consider subscribing. Not sure how frequently I will post, but a bigger subscriber count definitely boosts the motivation. Also, feel free to leave any suggestions for future videos and any thoughts you had on this one in the comments. But that's all from me. Thank you for watching.